In 1988, Owyhee, Nevada, was a small town of just over 1,000 people, nestled along U.S. Highway 225. The town, primarily inhabited by members of the Shoshone-Paiute tribes, had an air of eerie isolation. Its wide, empty streets and dilapidated buildings seemed frozen in time, forgotten by the outside world. Surrounded by barren desert and mountains, Owyhee was the kind of place where time moved slowly and secrets ran deep. For the residents, life had always been difficult, but something had shifted in recent years, something sinister. There were whispers of a malevolent force lurking in the mountains, something that stalked the town and kept them captive. It wasn't just the poverty or the isolation that oppressed Owyhee, it was the sense that they were being watched, that an ancient evil had taken hold of their home. It started with the disappearances. People would simply vanish, usually at night, after dark. No one would see them leave, and no one would hear any signs of a struggle. One day, they'd be there, sitting at the local diner or walking to the store, and the next, their house would be empty, their car left behind. The town chalked it up to people leaving in search of a better life. Owyhee wasn't the kind of place that offered much hope, after all. But then, the bodies started turning up. At first, it was animals, deer, coyotes, and once, even a wild horse, found mutilated in the desert, their flesh torn from their bones as if by some enormous predator. The residents tried to blame it on wild animals or even starvation, but deep down, they knew something else was responsible. It wasn't long before human bodies began to appear, and that's when the fear truly set in. The bodies were found in the mountains, miles from town, with the same mutilations as the animals. They were barely recognizable, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Sheriff Hank Whitehorse, a stoic Shoshone man who had lived in Owyhee his entire life, was the first to speak aloud what everyone else had been thinking: the Wendigo had come for them. The Wendigo was a creature from Native American folklore, a malevolent spirit that possessed those who had committed the unforgivable sin of cannibalism. Once a person was consumed by the Wendigo spirit, they became a monster, tall, gaunt, and insatiably hungry for human flesh. In the Shoshone-Paiute legends, the Wendigo was not just a story to frighten children, it was a real, living force of evil, a punishment from the spirits for breaking the sacred laws of survival. Sheriff Whitehorse had heard the stories from his grandparents, but he had never believed them until now. The Wendigo was said to haunt the mountains, especially in the winter when food was scarce and desperation set in. It preyed on the weak and the lost, luring them into its lair before feasting on their bodies and souls. Once the Wendigo marked a place as its hunting ground, no one could leave, and no one could escape its hunger. In Owyhee, the Wendigo had claimed the entire town. By the time summer of 1988 rolled around, Owyhee had become a prison. No one dared leave their homes after dark, and anyone passing through on Highway 225 was warned by locals not to stop. The sheriff imposed an unofficial curfew, though he rarely had to enforce it. Everyone in town knew what would happen if they ventured out at night. But even with the precautions, people continued to disappear. It was as if the Wendigo was growing bolder, more desperate. The mutilated bodies of the missing were found closer and closer to town, until one night, a local rancher named Billy Henderson went missing from his own home. Billy had lived on the outskirts of Owyhee, near the mountains, and was known as a tough, no-nonsense man. When his wife woke up to find him gone, she immediately ran into town to find Sheriff Whitehorse. A search party was organized, but they all knew what they would find. Billy's body was discovered the next morning, just outside his barn. His face was twisted in horror, his chest ripped open, and his heart missing. There was no question now, something unnatural was stalking Owyhee. The residents of Owyhee began to realize they were trapped. The few who attempted to leave were never heard from again. Some had tried to drive out during the day, hoping to escape before nightfall, but they never made it far. Their cars were found abandoned on the highway, with no trace of the drivers. Those who stayed in town tried to continue their lives as best they could, but the fear was palpable. The air itself seemed to thicken with dread as the days grew shorter and the nights longer. Even during the day, there was a sense that something was watching them, lurking just beyond the edges of town. And then there were the lights. Some nights, strange lights would appear in the mountains, glowing faintly at first, then brighter, until they seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. The townsfolk tried to explain it away. Perhaps it was a natural phenomenon, or maybe some hunters had set up camp. But deep down, they knew it was the Wendigo. The lights were its eyes, watching, waiting. The last time anyone saw outsiders was in late August of 1988. A young couple from California, completely unaware of the town's curse, drove through Owyhee on their way to Idaho. They had stopped at the local gas station, planning to fill up before continuing their trip. The locals watched them nervously, but no one dared approach them. They knew what would happen if the couple stayed too long. Sheriff Whitehorse was the only one brave enough to speak to them. He tried to warn them, told them to leave immediately and not to stop until they were miles away. The couple, confused and a little frightened, took his warning to heart and sped out of town as fast as their old Chevy would take them. But they didn't make it far. The next morning, their car was found just 10 miles north of Owyhee, parked on the side of Highway 225. The couple's bodies were discovered a mile away in the desert, mutilated in the same grotesque way as the others. Their faces were twisted in horror, their eyes wide open as if they had seen something too terrible to comprehend. It was clear now, no one, not even outsiders, could escape the Wendigo's grasp. As summer faded into autumn, the town's population continued to dwindle. People were too afraid to leave their homes at night, and even during the day, Owyhee was a ghost town. Businesses closed, schools were abandoned, and the streets were eerily silent. The only sound was the wind howling through the desert, carrying with it the stench of death. Sheriff Whitehorse, now a man on the edge of madness, knew there was only one way to stop the Wendigo. The legend said that the creature could only be killed by fire, if one was brave enough to confront it. But no one in town had the courage to face the Wendigo, not after seeing what it had done to Billy Henderson and the others. Whitehorse, however, had nothing left to lose. On the night of the autumn equinox, when the desert was at its darkest, Whitehorse armed himself with a shotgun and a torch. He left a note in his office, instructing the remaining townsfolk to flee as soon as the sun rose. Then, he made his way into the mountains, following the strange lights that pulsed in the distance. He never returned. The next morning, the townsfolk found his body near the old mining caves, burned beyond recognition. His shotgun was empty, and the torch lay extinguished beside him. The Wendigo was gone, but so was Sheriff Whitehorse. By the end of 1988, Owyhee was a ghost town. The last few residents packed their belongings and left, scattering across Nevada and Oregon, never to return. The Wendigo had claimed the town, and no one was willing to risk their lives by staying. Highway 225, once a busy route for travelers, became desolate. No one stopped in Owyhee anymore. The gas station, the diner, and the few remaining houses stood empty, slowly decaying under the harsh desert sun. And at night, if you stood in the right place, you could still see the lights in the mountains, flickering like distant stars, a reminder that some evils never truly die. Owyhee had become a place of legend, a cursed town where an ancient evil once walked the earth, and where the Wendigo's hunger would never be satisfied.